India wants to build a wall across the ocean, 60 kilometers of concrete and rock, stretching shore to shore across the Gulf of Kambat, sealing out the Arabian Sea and sealing in what would become the largest freshwater reservoir humans have ever engineered. Cost, north of $14 billion. Difficulty, building it in a gulf where the tide swings 11 meters, twice a day, every day, forever. Here's the part that should stop you. This isn't a new idea. Someone sketched it out in 1975. And then, for the better part of 50 years, almost nothing happened. Not because engineers forgot about it, because nobody could make the numbers survive contact with reality long enough to break ground. That freeze is worth understanding before anything else, because it explains almost everything about why Kalpasar looks the way it does today. Big Indian infrastructure plans don't usually stall for 5 decades by accident. They stall because the arithmetic never quite closes at the moment someone has to sign the check. Every few years, a new state government would reopen the Kalpasar file, commission a fresh feasibility study, watch the cost estimate come back higher than the last one, and quietly file it away again. Nobody wanted to be the administration that killed it outright, because politically, promising a 50-year-old dream of drought relief costs nothing. Actually funding it costs billions, with no guarantee the dam survives the tides it's built to fight. So it became something closer to a political heirloom than a construction project, passed from one government to the next, always alive on paper, never alive on a work site. What finally broke the stalemate wasn't money, it was expertise. Dutch engineers arrived with something India's own planners didn't have. A working, tested design for exactly this kind of barrier, refined over nearly a century of trial and error. That gave the project something it had never had before, a credible answer to the question that had frozen every previous government. Not, should we build this, but can this actually be built without failing? Once that question had a real answer, the political calculus flipped. Suddenly inheriting the file meant something different. It meant being the government that finally moved it off the shelf. To understand why anyone was willing to gamble on this in the first place, look at who's actually asking for it. Much of the Netherlands sits below sea level, and the Dutch have spent centuries turning the ocean into something they can negotiate with rather than fear. Their defining achievement, the Afsluitdijk, closed off part of the North Sea in 1932, turning brackish water into a freshwater lake using the same basic principle Kalpasar is now chasing at twice the length. But length is almost the least important difference between the two projects. The North Sea basin, the Dutch sealed off, is geologically quiet, with no meaningful earthquake risk and no cyclone season stacking storm surges on top of tidal peaks. Kalpasar inherits the Dutch method and then hands it 2 problems the original engineers never had to design around. A foundation resting in an active seismic zone and an ocean capable of throwing tropical cyclones directly at the structure during the very tides it's meant to withstand. Borrowing the blueprint was the easy part. Borrowing the weather was not an option. So why does India need this badly enough to take that risk? Because right next door to the answer sits the problem. Gujarat's Saurashtra Peninsula is one of the most chronically water-stressed regions in the country, dependent on unreliable monsoons and wells drilled ever deeper as the water table keeps retreating. And just across the Gulf of Kambat, rivers like the Narmada, the Mahi, and the Sabarmati are dumping enormous volumes of fresh water directly into the sea every single day, gone the instant it mixes with salt. Kalpasar's core idea is to intercept that waste before it happens. Dam the Gulf, hold the river flow behind the barrier, and let it gradually push the salt water out until what remains is a reservoir roughly 2,000 square kilometers wide, holding nearly 8 billion cubic meters of fresh water, enough to irrigate over 1 million hectares and supply drinking water to a region that has never had enough of it. It's a clean solution to a real problem. The site chosen for it is anything but clean to build in. Picture the Gulf of Kambat less as a bay and more as a natural amplifier for tidal energy, wide at its mouth and narrowing hard as it runs north, so incoming water gets compressed with nowhere to release except upward. It's the same basic physics behind Canada's Bay of Fundy, which holds the record for the world's most extreme tides, except here that compression happens on ground that also shakes. That combination doesn't just add up, it compounds. The narrowing gulf accelerates the current along with the tide, dragging heavy volumes of silt through the channel twice daily, while the seabed underneath sits in an active earthquake zone, meaning 60 kilometers of foundation would need to stay intact through both tremors and a floor that never stops shifting. This isn't a checklist of 4 unrelated hazards. It's one interconnected environment where each factor makes the others harder to engineer around. Gujarat has already seen a smaller-scale version of what failure looks like here. In 1979, the Machchu Dam near Morbi collapsed after extreme monsoon flooding, and within roughly 20 minutes a wall of water tore through the town downstream. Estimates of the death toll vary enormously depending on the source, from as low as 1,800 to as high as 25,000. In part because mass graves were used to stop the spread of disease before an official count could ever be completed. Kalpasar is structurally nothing like Machchu. One holds back a tidal sea, the other held back a swollen river, so the comparison only stretches so far. But it's part of why Gujarat's engineers think about failure margins differently than most. Now for the problem almost nobody mentions when they describe Kalpasar as a water security fix. The rivers feeding this reservoir, especially the Sabarmati and the Mahi, are among the most industrially polluted waterways in the country, carrying decades of untreated effluent downstream from factories and cities. Sealing that water inside a 60-kilometer basin doesn't dilute the problem, it concentrates it. Water that currently flushes out to sea with every tidal cycle would instead accumulate in a closed reservoir meant to irrigate over 1 million hectares and supply drinking water to a drought-stressed population. And the reservoir creates a mirror image problem on the other side of the wall. As fresh water gradually displaces salt water inside the basin, that salt water has to go somewhere, and current plans call for discharging it back into the Arabian Sea. Concentrated brine released at that volume risks creating hypersaline dead zones, patches of ocean where oxygen collapses and marine life can't survive. Kalpasar isn't running one unproven experiment, it's running 2 simultaneously, trapping decades of pollution in a basin the size of a small country, while discharging decades of concentrated salt into a coastal fishery that local communities still depend on for their livelihoods. There's a quieter motive behind all of this, and it has nothing to do with farmland. China controls the headwaters of major rivers that eventually reach northern India, a geographic fact New Delhi has no way to negotiate around. A freshwater reserve built entirely within Indian territory sidesteps that vulnerability completely. In an era where upstream nations increasingly treat river flow as a bargaining chip, a reservoir nobody else can throttle is worth more than its irrigation numbers alone suggest. Then there's the price of admission, which keeps climbing. The 2022 pre-feasibility estimate for Kalpasar sat around 1 lakh crore rupees. By the time Gujarat formally applied for environmental clearance in May 2026, that figure had grown to roughly 1.33 lakh crore rupees, about $14 billion. And the direction of that trend line isn't hard to guess. Gujarat's government has set a target of finishing construction within 8 years of getting approval. Outside estimates put the real number closer to 10 or 15, which would push completion into the mid-2030s at the earliest. And India's track record with mega projects doesn't inspire confidence in the shorter number. Vizhinjam Port, Kerala's flagship deep-water port, was originally supposed to open in 2019. Its first phase didn't actually go live until late 2024, 5 years behind schedule. And its remaining phases were only fast-tracked after a fresh agreement in 2024 compressed the 2045 deadline down to 2028. A first-of-its-kind ocean dam fighting tides, seismic risk, and ecological review all at once has every reason to slip even further than that. For now, none of it exists yet. The tide still climbs 11 meters and falls back twice a day, exactly as it has for thousands of years, across a gulf that has never been crossed by anything close to what's now sitting in front of India's environmental regulators. 50 years ago, this was a sketch nobody could afford to fund. Today, it's a live application, backed by Dutch engineering and Indian political will, finally pointed in the same direction at the same time. Whether that's enough is the only question left. A dam doesn't care how long an idea sat on a shelf, or how many governments quietly inherited the file without touching it. It only cares whether the concrete holds when the tide comes in at 11 meters, on schedule twice a day for the next 100 years. India has decided that bet is worth taking. The ocean hasn't agreed to anything yet.